The following featured presentation is part of the Skywalking Network.
Welcome to Star Warsologies, the podcast about science and other academic fields of study seen in Star Wars. I'm one of your co-hosts, James Floyd. I'm a freelance writer for Star Wars Insider magazine and StarWars.com.
And I'm Melissa Miller, also a freelance writer for Star Wars Insider magazine, mostly science-type articles. In this episode, Star Warsologies is going to chat about space travel and planetary science in Star Wars, from zipping through hyperspace and dodging asteroids and all the cool planets we see along the way. Our guest expert today is Johnny Brendle. He's a project support specialist at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center. Welcome, Johnny.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, welcome.
And you two connected at Comic-Con. Is that how this all came about?
That's how it worked. Yeah, so we were doing education outreach for some of our planetary science from Jet Propulsion Laboratory at NASA's California, right outside of LA in Pasadena. The laboratory there runs the booth that we have at San Diego Comic-Con every year. I don't know if I was in costume or not, James.
I don't think you were when I saw you.
I was manning the booth for a little while, off and on, and also enjoying the con. So it was a great trip, and I'm so glad to connect with you guys.
Well, it was fun to meet you and learn about some of the cool things that are going on at JPL. Can you tell us what you do as a project support specialist?
Sure. So the lines are certainly blurred for this position in terms of where I fall in the task lists for different positions. A project support specialist is really kind of a fill-in-the-gap type of role. So mine in particular is a lot to do with our communications, both internal and external. So a lot of my time is spent right now at Goddard Space Flight Center. We have 4 science divisions. And so I studied astrophysics, but I support mostly the Earth science at the moment. I'm doing a little bit of internal communications, helping talk about our Earth science missions and why they're important and what we're doing with Earth science in terms of the entire division. And I bring that to our science director. It's a mouthful. There's a lot of acronyms. And on the external side, I talk about some of the projects that we have going on. So some of the bigger ones at the Goddard Space Flight Center could be the James Webb Space Telescope. We're building another telescope called the Nancy Grace Roman Space Telescope. So that's a joy to go, pop out for a lunch and walk over to the clean room viewing area and see them build it. Wow. As well as the Hubble Space Telescope. So I just talked about space telescopes, but we also run most of our sun science out of the Goddard Space Flight Center. So we have our Solar Dynamics Observatory mission. Really, any more modern image that you see of the sun, regardless of the wavelength, typically comes from SDO, Solar Dynamics Observatory. So yeah, we have our heliophysics division there, which is sun science. Cool. The other division I didn't mention was the Solar System Exploration Division, which is mostly planetary. But one of the really cool things that they have right now at Goddard are some samples from the asteroid Bennu from part of the OSIRIS-REx mission. So the OSIRIS-REx mission, part of it is run out of Goddard. So we have a plethora of nerds from all different types. We also have a big engineering group, fabrication groups, just any different type of person at Goddard. So it's quite a joy to be there.
That's awesome. So what's your relationship with Star Wars, and did it influence your career or your passion for astrophysics at all growing up?
It was a battle growing up between Star Wars and Star Trek. And for me, I chose Star Wars. It was a little bit easier to keep up with, I would say, at least growing up. For Star Wars, there's always this kind of, how does this work? How does that work? And I mean, as we know, there's a lot of things in Star Wars that, in the sense of physics, really can't work out, that really don't make sense. But we find that a lot with actual physics, astrophysics in particular, particle physics, a lot of unknowns, but things that we notice in our universe that kind of trying to figure out what questions to ask is super intriguing. And I think that sort of spark came from things like Star Wars, especially these sort of unknown questions. And then being able to now delve in a little bit better and have a better understanding of what could be happening in Star Wars is awesome. And anytime we can tie the physical work that we do at NASA to the science fiction side, whether it be Star Wars, Star Trek, or anything out there, it's awesome. It's a lot of fun. Yeah. And it's, I work with a lot of nerds too. So it's, a lot of them, actually, most of the people I work with are Trekkies, but there's a few people in there that are Star Wars fans. We had a Halloween event at NASA one time, and the director for science communications and then the director for all of science was a former astronaut, Pierce Sellers. The two of them had worn Jedi costumes to work, and they had their lightsabers out. You just have these people that are kind of way up there, but they still have fun, and they have fun with things like Star Wars. So really great to see, and the influence that Star Wars has on the folks at NASA.
That's awesome.
Cool. So you mentioned, trying to solve the problems and look at things and see how the physics works. How do you think hyperspace travel works in Star Wars?
That was a really big thing because when you start studying physics or astrophysics, we put things in terms of these great distances like light years, how far away a light year is. And it's just almost unfathomable. And you think, well, how could they travel from one end of a galaxy to another end of a galaxy and still be the same age? Make it seem like it was just, like a flight from Philly to DC, something really short, right? It was difficult to understand at first, but through research, I found that hyperspace is actually a separate dimension. And so this is Star Wars' way of not having to answer those questions to
Mhm.
physics. I think if I could compare a movie that really tries to do that, it's The Martian does a great job, but also Interstellar. Interstellar,
Mhm.
they really try to figure out the physics behind traveling at these great speeds, traveling next to super large masses, and how that affects the warping of space and time.
Right.
And I think Star Wars was like, you know what? This is a little bit much for us right now. We'll just put them in their own dimension that doesn't have the same constraints that our what we call free space, our Euclidean three-dimensional space with time, how it works for us. So yeah, the sort of sidestepping definitely helps.
Yeah.
But what I'm reading is that we have these tunnels in their own dimensions for traveling, and there's a lot of constraints for it. But hyperspace is its own separate dimension, and only certain vehicles can go travel at hyperspace, and they need special ways to do it. It's very intriguing.
So how would these tunnels work? Could you just simply say, "Hey, I want a tunnel from, Alderaan to Tatooine," or would I have to find an existing tunnel? It would be like I have to find a subway station that gets me close to where I want to go.
Yeah, no, I think I would compare it to the jet stream,
Mm.
where the jet stream is going to help an airplane move faster. It's helping push it. This isn't necessarily a jet stream, but it's a similar concept of trajectory in terms of the spacecraft being able to put it in the right direction to get into this sidestepped dimension of hyperspace. And to do that isn't something that you can just do with any vehicle and do it any
Mhm.
time. I mean, I think there are some instances in Star Wars where we see them essentially just like jump in a vehicle, get up there, and then jump right into hyperspace. And looking back at Star Wars lore, it isn't necessarily like that. I think sometimes it's, obviously for cinematic purposes, but hyperspace, you definitely have to plan your route because there are things like mass shadows
Mhm.
that can get in the way. And there are the things that we've seen. I don't remember what film, but we saw the Empire actually blockade the entrance to
Right.
hyperspace.
Yeah, the Kessel, yeah, they were blockading kind of the exit from the maelstrom, and so they had to kind of cut through the rough part of the maelstrom, the unexplored part,
Right.
and then find as they were crashing into stuff that like there's our one escape and it puts us in the right direction of where we want to go.
Yeah. When you were talking, I was picturing the EAC in Finding Nemo, where they
Oh yeah,
like
yeah,
get
yeah.
they get in the current and then they're like, okay, here's your exit. I like that. And I'm curious, but
No,
have
I
you
haven't
seen
used this in that
Ahsoka?
yet. Yes,
Okay.
the
Yeah, I
newer
didn't want
stuff.
to I didn't want to spoil anything, but I did want to ask, how the tunnels and stuff like that would be different for going intergalactically versus within the one galaxy far, far away.
That was something that I really couldn't find a lot on. The galaxies that they're traveling to that are separate, there's only, I think, one or two instances in Star Wars where this has happened.
Mhm.
And it's typically what we would refer to as like a companion galaxy.
Hmm.
So, like the large Magellanic Cloud for the Milky Way,
Mhm.
it's not traveling to the Andromeda Galaxy, which is our next closest actual, large scale, our size-ish galaxy.
Yeah, they kind of mention, I think, in Attack of the Clones, looking for Camino south of the Rishi Maze, where the Rishi Maze, I think, is supposed to be like a micro galaxy within the larger Star Wars galaxy.
Right. Well,
And
and when
then
we had our astronomer on, I remember because it's not something I ever clocked, but I think it's what at the end of Empire
Empire.
Strikes Back or whatever, there's like Luke and Leia and C-3PO and R2D2 looking out of like a space dock or whatever and looking at a galaxy that's like right there. And I was like, oh, yeah, I like never even clocked it. As like non-astronomer, I was like, oh, that's a pretty scene. And then to our astronomer, she was like, what does that mean?
I have to go back and see that because I was actually thinking about that the other night. I mean, I was thinking about, they map their stars out pretty well. Obviously, they travel them, but I really hadn't seen much about background galaxies which
Yeah,
is very
it's a
fun.
famous, just literally like last shot of the whole movie. So you'll recognize it as soon as you see it and then be like, oh no, what
I'm
does
gonna
it
go
mean?
back. Yeah, I definitely need to see that.
Don't think about it too much now because we did go into it with our astronomer Lisa.
Well, you had just brought something up, Ahsoka, right? Where we have the purgils.
Yes.
Yeah, right. Those are, I mean, obviously, when we're talking about getting into hyperspace, there are ways to do it, where they develop technology to be able to do this, put it onto a hyperdrive, I guess is what they would call it. But only a few things that can do it naturally, or at least a couple, and a purgle being one of them. I thought those were super, super interesting and how far back they go into lore and how they influenced hyperdrives, their scientists to develop a hyperdrive. And for anybody who's wondering what the purgle is, it's that big whale squid looking object that we saw in Ahsoka.
Yeah. You think about like the energy that it takes, the coaxium that fuels ships for hyperspace. And then it's like, where do you think the purgle are getting that amount of energy? Or is it something else, the force or something?
I want to say through the force because I mean I really honestly couldn't think of anything else that would bring some sort of power that wouldn't already be part of the system essentially. I mean obviously being a natural being there's a chance that they could be connected to the force. I mean we've seen it all throughout Star Wars where we have beings that are connected to the force that you wouldn't expect to be even if we're just talking about Jedi.
Yeah.
So maybe a purgle could be that would be really cool to see a lightsaber on a purgle.
I'm picturing how big the robes would have to be for a purgle.
Oh, yeah.
But I'm imagining the robes flow really well with the squid
Oh,
tentacles.
yeah,
Oh
very,
yeah, yeah.
very cinematic for sure.
And that one braid of hair.
Oh God, the rat tail when they're Padawan.
The
Yeah.
Padawan braid.
Oh
That
my God.
all
This
right.
is delightful. Someone please draw this up. I am not artistic and send it to
I'm
us.
now just imagining, the Purgle lightsaber being like big enough to swat a Star Destroyer in half.
Right. And then done. That's the only Jedi you ever
Right?
need, right? So,
Or deflecting the Death Star laser.
Yeah.
yeah. So for hyperspace, I'm always curious about like how it works, right? Do you think that they would have to like log their route? I mean, I know that in space is big and the idea of running into somebody is very astronomically, hey, I didn't even need to make a pun, James. Astronomically small. But, do you think they're like one way? Is it like, oh, those like lights in narrow tunnels where it's like, oh, someone's coming from the other way, so you wait here until they exit? Is it a two-way street? Is there traffic control? Like, how would that have to work?
Gosh, well, so from what I can tell, it's both in real space and it's in their hyperspace dimension. I mean, if it exists in real space, then yeah, they definitely need to account for other ships. My question for Star Wars people is how big is this tunnel? When we're seeing these light streak, I mean, I would imagine what we're seeing are stars, right? Would that mean that the tunnel is probably half a light year across it? I mean, it really could be.
Right.
Right.
I
Well,
don't know that they would really need to pay as much attention to direction, but it does seem kind of like what you were saying, the waterway for the turtles that they use in Finding Nemo and the jet stream
Oh,
for the
yeah.
airplanes.
so you could, see maybe in there and be able, okay, I can avoid this. I can
Right.
swerve a little bit within the tunnel.
I think they could, but I think that they need to plan their routes to not go through asteroid fields, things like that.
Right.
I mean, when we see an asteroid field, we're thinking about something that goes around a star, right? So as long as you're not too close to a star, I think you'll be okay. The other thing they would have to worry about is like an Oort cloud.
Mm-hmm.
And our solar system extends to the very, very outer edge. And our Oort cloud and Alpha Centauri's Oort cloud are very close to each other. So there's these dance between, I want to say rocks, but chunks of ice, rocks, what could be comets.
Sorry, what
Objects
is
up there.
this word? Or orc?
Ort.
I'm like, ort.
Oort.
Okay.
Yeah, it's actually OORT.
Okay.
So, I mean,
Ort.
as far as
So
I
the
know,
Canadian
it's
ort.
yeah, maybe. Yeah, well, that absolutely could be. So,
Is it an
yeah,
acronym? Like I've literally just never heard this term before.
no. It's. I think there's another language that
Mm.
derives the actual word for what it is, but I think we just call it the Oort cloud. And I
Okay.
think from that, but yeah, no, it's super far away and it's a large field. But what we're seeing there are things that could be defined at some point as comets. We think that comets come from there, and that they have these really elongated, highly elliptical orbits. So we don't see Halley's comet for something like 250 years or something like that. A very long time because it has to make this
I
really,
think only
really.
like 75
Yeah,
years.
that one I know because I saw it as a little kid, and I remember my dad saying that you might get to see it twice in your lifetime. I was 5 when it came around before, so it was like I might get to see that one twice.
Yeah, but there's definitely ones
But
that
there
are
are
on the
some.
much
Oh,
longer
yeah,
scale.
there was one. You know what I'm thinking about is the one that passed by Earth back in 2016. I wasn't able to see it, but it was some, super narrow elliptical orbit
Mhm.
around.
Okay.
But we think that these, there's this sort of, like I said, a dance between stars. But it's something that they have to obviously look out for if they're traveling in hyperspace. Not just that, but I guess what they were looking for are called the mass shadows. So anything in real space is going to leave behind in this alternate dimension a mass shadow. And the mass shadow really depends on the size of the object, but you can collide with a mass shadow in hyperspace dimension. I guess what they're really looking out for are these really, really large objects, planets, the
Mhm.
mass shadow from a planet. But a mass shadow, I guess in our sense, would be, if we think about space time on a two-dimensional plane, a piece of paper is space and time fabric woven in together. Or maybe a better comparison would be like a bed sheet, something that can actually bend without just tearing. But you put like a bowling ball in the middle of a bed and you have this like what seems to be two dimension now curving, right? So you see this curvature of space and time. And that would be what is casting the shadow, the mass shadow. That's the mass, the bending of space time. So there's a shadow cast. But you can have things that you maybe aren't really aware of. A black hole, something that you can't really see, is going to leave a massive mass shadow, but not really anything, something that you're not physically going to see. I
Like
think
in
that
Interstellar.
yeah, you can't see it, but obviously there's a very, very heavy mass pull, and they actually experienced time warp just by orbiting close to this black hole or being on a planet that was closer to the black hole. This warping of space and time meant that the astronaut that was on board I forgot the name on Interstellar, but whatever their ship was called,
Right.
the one in the ship, and then the others landed on this planet. In hyperspace, they're not going to experience time warp because they're not experiencing time the same way. I think the easiest comparison to conceptualize, at least for people who understand some of the astrophysics in terms of black holes, are wormholes. Not that that's something that we have evidence for in our real space, but a wormhole could be considered this sort of shortcut. But a wormhole, at least in the theoretical sense, we don't really know where the exit for the wormhole would be. And in
Right.
Star Wars, it seems like hyperspace is pretty well figured out in terms of, when to get off on the exit. I mean, I'm great with like visuals, but I feel like in hyperspace, I'd be done for. I wouldn't know when to cut off my hyperdrive. I'd probably be in the wrong end of the galaxy. So,
Yeah, there's
I
supercomputers or something, R2 there, if you're nice to him, will tell you kind of thing.
Yeah, I'm just thinking with all those mass shadows, you can kind of catch these tunnel current things and swing around things. And so maybe the most direct or the fastest way to get somewhere wouldn't necessarily be the straight line. It would be like we see in other things where they slingshot around planets, like even just with the Voyager missions and other satellites that use the gravity, but now you're doing it within these tunnels.
Well, and careful because that sends you back in time, at least in Star Trek. So, or
uh
Superman.
Only if you go 88 miles an hour.
Ah, there you go. It's interesting because you were talking about Star Wars versus Star Trek at the beginning. No one ever told me I had to choose, so I didn't, thankfully. And so if no one's ever told you that, Jonathan, you don't have to choose. It's not too late to be a Trekkie.
yeah, I need to.
When you're talking about wormholes, I always thought that was interesting because in Star Trek, they have wormholes. I mean, they have warp drive, obviously, too, but they have wormholes. But yeah, they never know where they come out. They never know if they're stable. Sometimes they're not big enough to send a ship through, but you can send like a video call or whatever through. And I always just thought that was interesting that they literally, I mean, as a writer, interesting that they just gave themselves more problems, basically. Like it's plot reasons kind of thing, but it's interesting to hear about the difference that is a wormhole theoretically, even though all these things are theoretical, that some of those differences at least are based in what we think might be true.
Oh yeah. So yeah, I mean, as far as current astrophysics, wormholes, we haven't really found evidence. I mean, on paper, I think they're really cool. Who knows? Maybe there will be some sort of big breakthrough in terms of dark
Yeah.
matter, dark energy, and
Yeah.
and maybe there will be a possibility that something like those could exist. But
Well, and especially with the name, right? Wormholes, right? Versus like our hyperspace lanes, purgill holes, So it doesn't roll off the tongue quite the same way, but
no, not necessarily. But I mean, I think they did a really great job in Star Wars, especially keeping up with the lore and maybe sprinkling in a little bit more information every time that they do something like a jump to hyperspace. I think it's, kind of parallel to our understanding of astrophysics in general, is we learn little by little over time and then eventually we get a big picture. And I'm hoping that I see that for other parts of astrophysics, but it's nice to at least get that sort of satisfaction with Star Wars.
Yeah. No, you said that at the beginning, and I was thinking, because it doesn't happen often, but I mean, this is how I enjoy my fandom, right? I overthink, I speculate, I ask, physicist questions about purgill holes. And, every once in a while I get people who are like, well, just enjoy it. And I'm like, this is me enjoying it. Like I am. I'm really, really enjoying this. It's one of the things that I'm gonna start using that as a go-to is like, the way we're speculating about Star Wars, people are still speculating about real physics, right? Like dark matter, those sorts of things. And I think that that's fun to point out for the next generation of people who want to get into science. It's always good to know that there's stuff to be figured out still, but also just in general, like it's okay. Like I don't need Star Wars to have it all figured out and tell me because the universe, we don't have it all figured
Yeah.
out.
And I mean, it's so cool that the nerds that are influenced by things like Star Wars are also some of the nerds that are writing these things, whether it be fan fiction or actually part of the series.
Yeah.
And they pay attention to those small details like that. And so at least I haven't really encountered anything in Star Wars where it completely just, doesn't make sense from information that we've had before. And that's something that we see in science a lot. There's a lot of things that we think we know what's happening and we truly don't. And then we find out that we were completely wrong.
Love it. Yeah. No,
That's something to tell all those people that nitpick the canon and they're just like, hey, in real life, our canon changes because we realize, oops, we had this all wrong.
yeah, no, like literally, I think these are talking points for why talking about science in Star Wars, increases science literacy in general. It's even just the concept of doing it, that it's all being figured out, and the next generation of people who were inspired by, the discovery of the Titanic are building ocean robots now, and so it's like it's the same thing as the generation of people who were inspired by the original trilogy and probably even now the prequels are writing and art directing and making props and stuff like that for Star Wars now. So like there's going to be some updates. If I were writing something, the first story we would get is like that Rancor Keeper because that's like my big moment in Star Wars. But yeah, I love that. Changing canon, changing science.
For some reason thought that when it's like those people that were studying the Titanic, they're building a new Titanic now. That's like, yes,
I
they
mean,
are. And
there are
that's
also people doing that. So, yes.
anyway, back to this. You mentioned the Oort clouds connecting between our star and Alpha Centauri, I think you said.
Yeah, the next closest star system.
So that could be kind of like how they go from Hoth through an asteroid field, and then they say they're in the Anoat system, and so it's like that asteroid field is kind of that combination where it crosses over to another system, and then they got to hike from there to the Bespin system, and that's all at like sublight speed. And yet, how long does it take them? They certainly don't age a lot in that
Yeah,
process.
yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, even at light speed, at least for the star system like our sun and Alpha Centauri, we're talking about over 4 light years. If you could travel at the speed of light in real space, it would take you 4 years to get there. Then you also got to slow down, so that would be really difficult too. But the Oort cloud, I mean, the way that I think about things like, we talk a lot about space junk at NASA. We get that question a lot. Is space junk a problem? Or are we having an issue being able to travel into space with a worry of space junk? Sure, yeah, man, we got to think about those things. But I think people mischaracterize how much space junk there is and the amount of space that it takes up. When we're talking about the amount of space junk between, 100 miles above the surface to 17,000, 18,000 miles above the surface. There's a good amount of space junk collectively there, but now we're talking about this sort of radius of junk that's insanely large. I mean, can you imagine a highway that had 1,000 layers to it and it was fully encompassing the Earth? You wouldn't probably have an issue with traffic. You'd probably just be able to find a way to go. So if you think about that more on a grand sense of like the Oort cloud or the asteroid belt, I mean, odds are if you were to shoot yourself right through the asteroid belt, you probably wouldn't hit anything. I mean, there's a very, very, very good chance you would not hit anything. The same thing with the Oort cloud. So I think there's a lot of chances that they take with this hyperspace travel or even with their actual travel. But, that's the thing about Star Wars is that there are systems that are so different than where we're at. Our solar system, I mean, is developed, right? Like we have our planets, but to be able to travel to, a protoplanetary system, a system where the star has essentially just finished being formed, it's still forming, and the solar system, their solar system is still forming, then you might see a lot of little tiny rocks, a lot of dust, a lot of gas. That's something that I hadn't really considered before in terms of this sort of travel, how large those systems are. The same thing when we look at a nebula from Earth. I mean, if you look, we can see these in our own galaxy, these nebulas, the Horsehead Nebula, the Carina Nebula, the Eagle Nebula, the Pillars of Creation. The actual vast size of these are absolutely insane. But to also consider what they are, gas and dust, right? You're going to be traveling through it. I mean, what would that be like? Obviously, the scale is so large that, I mean, I don't think you would really run into anything. But then again, it is gas and dust. I mean, we can't see through it, right? We have to use different wavelengths to be able to see through it. And that's why I think it was so easy with Star Wars just to sidestep it and say, well, how about this be a non-space dimension? Right. This be a non-time dimension. This is just something completely different.
Yeah, or if they watch Star Trek, they know not to go into a nebula because you always pick up some new alien species or someone goes insane or something like that.
You get
or you
weird
start
ion
singing.
things and
right.
Oh yeah.
But you mentioned the protostar and having lots of things closer together, and that would make more sense for, like, in Empire Strikes Back, we have that whole asteroid field chase of them diving in and out of asteroids, and they're very close. Yeah, if in general, going through the asteroid field, you could just go in a straight line and probably not hit anything. But if you have it that dense, maybe like in a protostar or something where the object that broke apart into asteroids, if it was formed that way, it's still fairly compact and hasn't spread out yet.
Absolutely. Things like that with like the rings of Saturn, right? Like there's a sort of more dense collection of things like that where, yeah, you could probably film some sort of chase through the rings of Saturn. It might not be as closely packed as what you see in Star Wars, but something very similar.
So the ring of Geonosis that Obi-Wan and Jango Fett play cat and mouse in, that seems plausible.
Right. Or what I was thinking too was like the asteroid, or I don't know what they're called at that point, for Alderaan, right? When it explodes.
Too soon.
Yeah, I know. It's always too soon. But, the asteroid field outside of Hoth is much more densely packed for one that's just sort of always been there or been there for a long time. Whereas it makes sense that the chunks are that close together because Alderaan like just blew up.
I mean, I would love to see something like that. I mean, up close, we talked about, you just mentioned the Titanic. I feel like, you go down through these several miles of ocean. What is it, like 3 miles down or something like that?
Yeah.
And in the darkness, you see the bow appear, right? For some of the explorers, that I'm just like, that would be so cool. And we've seen this in Star Wars where it's like, you don't see these things until you get really close. They have headlights on some of their ships. Yeah. I don't know how the headlight would work in hyperspace.
Yeah, never thought about that.
I was going to say, that's like the physics problem from high school. It's like if you're traveling the speed of light and you turn your headlights on, and somebody turns their flashlight on towards you, what happens?
And what's crazy is that if we think about that problem, let's just say that, we actually could go 99.99999% the speed of light. And if we were doing that in the ship and we turned on our headlights, they would work just like headlights. They would turn on and the light would travel. It would appear to us to travel the speed of light away from us. But then the outside observer wouldn't see the same thing. They would see that we are experiencing time differently. Yeah, it's what we call time warp. But yeah, it depends on the frame of reference. I won't nerd out too much about it. But
I mean, it's literally the premise of the podcast. You can if you want to. I literally never considered what happens to headlights in space.
It's similar to sound. If you are traveling close to the speed of sound and you honk your horn, the sound waves are going to go away from, like in your car, it's going to sound like you're honking your horn. But anybody in front of you or anybody behind you is going to hear something completely, totally different.
Wow. Get like an ice cream truck or something, going Mach 1 and just to hear what an ice cream truck music sounds like.
No, that's what I'm picturing. I'm like the speed records that they do like out in the salt flats or whatever. Like, why not honk, while you're going by the cameras and stuff. Now I need to know. But the ice cream truck is actually the perfect option.
Oh yeah, that would be the vehicle to be able to do it too.
Oh, delightful. Well, and I mean, this is sort of off topic, so if it's not your expertise, just let us know. But I'm rewatching The Acolyte because we're going to do a Science of the Acolyte panel at LA Comic-Con coming up. There's just a quick scene of like a fire in space. And I wasn't even thinking about it. My husband was like, I wonder what burns in space. And I was like, oh, I didn't even think about that.
Yeah, so in terms of that one, what was the fire exactly?
It was like some pressurized vessel got over pressurized and split. And so one assumes like the gas as it exited was catching fire.
Yeah, well, I mean, if it's something flammable and you have an oxidizer doesn't necessarily mean, oxygen. I mean, we use oxygen a lot for our spacecraft in terms of propulsion. So we have fires in space, or what appears to be fires in space, and that's when we're using our thrust. But it's directed. It's not like a billowing smoke fire or anything like that. If you have an oxidizer and you have something combustible or flammable, then yeah, absolutely. You can create some sort of flame in space. And what is a flame? It's plasma. It's a charged element or a charged compound.
Right. Okay.
Now it just makes me think, when they do have that fire, it would be thrust essentially, and so it should
Oh.
cause them to spin out of control or move in ways they didn't expect because it's not like a thruster they had planned for.
Right, just
Oh
a
yeah,
little
yeah.
bit, if nothing else. It should move the ship in that direction. Interesting.
Yeah, that leak. I mean, I think we see that in The Martian when they
Right.
expel some of their nodes on their spacecraft to be able to shoot the air out of it. They airlock it and then open up the door and it expels the pressurized cabin air and it ends up,
Right.
I think, speeding them up or slowing them down or something.
I think that slows them down. Well, what other topics do we want to make sure we get to? If we want to talk about planets or blowing up planets, those are the sort of two big topics left.
Blowing up planets sounds
Okay.
insane.
We sort of got into Alderaan, so yeah, might as well just run with it.
Yeah, I guess, well, yeah, speaking of Alderaan, blowing up planets and the amount of energy you would need to do that to make a planet completely blow. I mean, obviously it depends on the size of the planet and what the planet is made out of. Alderaan was what was that? That was a rocky planet. That was like more of an Earth-like, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of the
So,
few they show us where there's like mountains and
Yeah.
oceans and a little bit of everything, I think.
so I wouldn't necessarily say that Alderaan was made of something that would make it explode, right? So these weapons would have to send the energy to the epicenter, to the very center of the planet. I mean, where else can I think of where something like that can happen than like a microwave? You can use a microwave oven and you can put something in there and you can touch the outside and it'll be cold, but the inside will be really hot. It makes me wonder, like, what type of energy could this be? Is it like a certain wavelength that is honed in for certain elements of this planet? If Alderaan is like maybe an iron or nickel core, are they
Huh.
sending this sort of energy to the planet that is, what would we call it? The frequency at which
Mhm.
iron or nickel energize or vibrate or ionize or whatever the case could be. Then I could see a case for that. But
Wow. I
Yeah.
hadn't thought of that. Yeah, you basically microwave at the frequency of iron or nickel or something, and that causes it to vibrate, and that could cause a big explosion rather than an actual laser, which you would think would just punch through a hole.
Yeah, detonate some core or something like that. Now I'm trying to remember if they ever, even in the newer things, sort of talk about exactly how it works. Or, because you talked about a microwave, I'm picturing, if you put like a potato in the microwave. So it's like, do you just need to put some fork holes in the planet and then you're safe from the
yeah,
Death Star? Like, if you had the equivalent, like, so on Mustafar, right, where we know there's volcanoes or whatever, if they shot the Death Star at that, would it just cause, hyper super volcanoes, but it wouldn't actually explode
Blorp.
because it has little off gases or whatever.
yeah, that's what they need on the Death Star. It's just like a big fork, and it just comes out and pokes some holes in there. But then it would probably just the entire planet would feel like Florida. It would just be,
Yeah.
be warm and miserable.
And you wonder also when you're cooking in the atmosphere like that, it would be like, oh, hey, yes,
Mhm.
everything that's water just gets cooked.
Right.
But it's like putting in your potato, but wrapping it in foil and putting it in your microwave and
Yeah.
destroying your microwave, but causing that big spark reaction.
Yeah. Well, and especially now because we're talking about giant forks and stuff, I'm thinking of Spaceballs, with the giant vacuum cleaner where they just suck
Oh my
all
gosh.
the oceans and atmosphere off of is it Druidia or something
Yeah.
like that, like which is actually the more efficient way to go about killing a planet.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That and depending on its star, getting rid of its magnetic field. That it's
Ah,
like a slow, painful death.
right. Okay. So wait, what would getting rid of a magnetic field do besides mess
Well,
up their Wi-Fi and stuff?
oh yeah, well yeah, it would mess up their Wi-Fi, absolutely. But
That is so dastardly.
that would be a very slow death. But without a magnetic field, we think about something like Mars. Mars, at one point, we believe, had a magnetic field, and the magnetic field helps capture and block some of the charged particles from the sun from desecrating the atmosphere. And
Ah,
we,
okay,
we
right.
see, with our magnetic poles, the northern and southern, we see the northern lights and the southern lights. And that's the charged particles being captured from our magnetic field and being thrown into the north pole of the planet or the southern pole. And we see these charged particles that ionize the gas. They shoot through the gas of the upper atmosphere and charge it to give it these colors. And these colors actually coordinate with what the gas is made of. I believe the green is mostly the hydrogen, right?
Right.
I mean, without a magnetic field, these charged particles would actually strip away the atmosphere. What we call the solar wind would essentially
Mhm.
blow the atmosphere very slowly, but it would happen off the planet. And then also, the atmosphere isn't really the best protector for, at least our atmosphere isn't the best protector for these charged particles. It's really our magnetic field that's helping us there. So we'd also have to worry about these charged particles reaching the surface and reaching the life. We would see DNA alteration. We would see cancer across the planet. I mean, there would be so many things that would affect life, all forms of life, plant life, animal life. And that's why Mars is like it is today. No atmosphere. Any sort of water exists below the surface. Yeah, it's not a place to be right now.
Could the Death Star be some sort of magnetic weapon that basically just overloads a planet's magnetosphere and uses kind of the repelling nature of magnetism to basically cause the planet to break up?
Could be. I think the easiest way to do that, for at least for a space weapon the size of the Death Star, would be maybe to use this sort of magnetism to slow the rotation of our core, the iron nickel core, because the rotation of our core is what is inducing the magnetic field, what is giving us the magnetic field. And so while Mars still has, as far as we can tell, an iron nickel core, it's no longer molten, it's no longer rotating, so it's not inducing any magnetic field. So if you could stop the core from spinning, then that could work. One way that I consider, think about this is, if you have a glass with ice and you start rotating the glass, the ice usually, stays in the same spot for a little while, but then it starts to pick up speed, right? It starts to follow with the way you're rotating, and certainly if you keep it at the same rotation. So why don't you take this planet, if it has a rotation, and rotate it the opposite direction? Well, that would also be a way to fling everybody off, but so there's that. There's so many ways. I mean, I feel like the end of this podcast is just us figuring out ways to destroy kill people and kill beings on planets.
You could field test this on uninhabited planets, right? No one said we had to do it on Alderaan.
We just have stormtrooper suits, stormtroopers or something like that.
There you go. There you go.
Stormtrooper dummies.
Yeah, exactly. It's like the nuclear testing sites. We'll just build a little fake town and watch it spin off into space when we rotate the planet the other way.
Build the planet. I mean, they built the Death Star.
Right. Yeah, yeah. And what I'm thinking, also, if you can stop the rotation, this is too big a can of worms to get into at the very end of the podcast here, but if you can stop the rotation, can you also restart the rotation of the core? Is this another way to terraform, right? Go to a dead planet, start it up again.
It's not the same, but we saw this in Avengers Infinity War, where Thor needed a hammer. He didn't have Mjolnir, right? So he needed something else. He got to the star.
Right.
The Forager was saying that the heart of this neutron star, it's a very, very dense star, it's no longer running. So what did they have to do? They had to rotate. They had to power it back up by putting it back into motion. But a neutron star rotates. Typically, we see very fast periods of time. It might rotate 10,000 times in a second. Some of them can do something absolutely insane, very small, but very dense. So like a keyboard key, if you're not using a laptop, a keyboard key on a regular keyboard, like the one that I have in front of me, a size of the letter A key, it would have the same mass as Mount Everest. It's super dense. And so I thought it was really cool seeing Thor essentially restart the motion of the star to get it running again. But yes, something like that in Star Wars, it's why couldn't they do that? I mean, if they can build the Death Star, I don't see why they couldn't.
I feel like now we'll have to have a panel, James, of other ways the Empire could have, done mass scatter. And just a bunch of smart people who aren't evil be like, if I were evil, here's how I would, do this.
And had some government grants.
Right. Yes. Oh, yeah. You got to have the money. Yeah. You got to have the money and the power or whatever. But assuming you do, because I'll bet many of our experts, benevolent as they are, can think of more efficient ways for the Empire to have gone about killing. So,
all right. So if somebody was interested in working at NASA or working in astrophysics, how would they go about that?
Well, where I'm at Goddard, we have somewhere close to 11,000 people that work at the Goddard Space Flight Center. And about 70% of those people are contractors, and only about 30% are federal employees. There are so many, like I said earlier, there are so many different roles at NASA, not just the Goddard Space Flight Center, but NASA in general. They look for all types of people. The building next to me, they have seamstresses, people who are professional seamstresses that work on space blankets, things that we're going to use to cover the outside of a space telescope. And they're just really good at being seamstresses. They can work with these materials. They don't necessarily need a science background. They don't need an engineering background. There are a lot of roles like that at NASA that don't require the background that you might think that you need. There's so many opportunities. Definitely check USA Jobs if you're interested in seeing what types of positions are offered for federal employees. But then I would say if there's a role that you think is really awesome or something you want to do at NASA, find out somebody who has that role You can research it yourself and then look a little bit more into them. Maybe check their LinkedIn and see what contractor they work for. Then go to that contractor website and say, okay, well, what other positions do they have? Do they have anything similar to what I'm looking for? Spoiler alert, that's how I found my position. I found the people that were in the position that I wanted. I went through that contractor website and I found another position that came up and I said, yes, there we go. That's more in line with what I want to do. And here I am. So it works out well. Other opportunities, internships, fellowships, things like that. Intern.nasa.gov. I think the fellowship information is there as well. Typically that's a summer internship, but we have internships that run throughout the year. So always a joy to see the interns come in. A lot of them end up coming back, whether or not for another internship or full-time position at some point. It's always rated, or at least it has been for the last several years, the best place to work in government is NASA. So I would definitely suggest it to other people. And you get to meet a lot of nerds, so that's always fun.
Cool. So basically you're saying NASA is more than just rocket science.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Well, before we get too far off of Star Wars, tell us about your favorite Star Wars character.
My favorite Star Wars character is, this is almost like a cop-out answer, but it's Obi-Wan Kenobi. And that was the first ever Halloween where my mom didn't dress me up and I got to kind of choose a costume. The first year that I wasn't Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh or a dog. I'm one of 5 kids. And so there was a point in time where my mom was like, okay, I'll let him do something else and we won't all be, Winnie the Pooh characters. Or, she always tried to make it all something collective. But
right.
That was the first thing. I had seen the Phantom Menace and I was like, that's what I want to do.
I was going to ask which Obi-Wan. Yeah.
Yeah, so I had the Phantom Menace Obi-Wan costume with lightsaber. And my sister, that same year, she got the Anakin costume. And she was younger than me. I'm like, that's not fair, but it is what it is. So it would have been a perfect family thing. My little sister could have been Yoda or something, but ever since then, I have just appreciated his character development and just him as a character in general. Obi-Wan is certainly a role model if there are any others in Star Wars.
Well, where can people find you online? Do you have any upcoming publications? Are you on social media?
Yeah. So in terms of personal social media, Johnny Astronomy, I do that for TikTok. TikTok is more for little, short videos about science. I haven't uploaded one in a while. I'm terrible, but and then the Instagram, I either link to those posts or I post pictures about working at NASA. So you can.
Awesome.
It's a younger account. So, but there are some really cool stuff on there too. So. Yeah, if anybody has any questions about working at NASA or want to come to NASA, shoot me a message.
Awesome. Well, we'll make sure we share links to that and to the job pages and stuff like that you talked about so people can look into it for themselves.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure to meet you at Comic-Con, James.
I'm so glad you guys connected at Comic-Con. I think that's the reason James isn't in my Doctor Who video, because I was waiting. He was like, I'm going to stop by the NASA booth and then I'll meet you at Doctor Who. And then he never showed up. But it sounds like it was a good conversation and this has been really interesting. I really love talking to people who work in fields that I really just don't consider. Like, as long as physics knows what it's doing, it's none of my business kind of thing. So I always love talking to people whose brains, think differently and get to topics that I was never going to question headlights, on a Millennium Falcon or whatever. So love that we got into some of this stuff. Thank you so much for spending the time with us.
Yeah, thank you, Johnny.
Absolutely. A pleasure.
And that wraps up this episode of Star Warsologies. We want to thank our guest, Johnny Brendle, and we want to thank all of you for listening. Los Angeles Comic-Con is coming up in early October, and we've got a bunch of things going on. First off, Melissa is moderating Science of the Acolyte, Saturday, October 5th at 3 p.m. in room 304. We're going to have podcast guests Sawyer Markham and Drea Letamendi, as well as myself, and newcomer Michaela Lung to take on planetary sciences. We talk about the Acolyte.
Yes, very excited about that. I'll also be helping run a couple panels with friend of the podcast, Fawn Davis, who you might remember is an ILM alumni from the prequel era. We'll be going over some of the movies that he worked on, along with other behind-the-scenes folks. Sunday, October 6th at 12 p.m., we're going to do a Galaxy Quest 25th anniversary, which is going to be awesome. Best movie ever. And then at 2 p.m., we're going to do a joint Nightmare Before Christmas and Coraline panel. It's those movies' 30th and 15th anniversaries, respectively. So we've got lots of fun insights. Both of those take place in room 304 as well.
Awesome. Also, my first Star Wars book, Star Wars Crossword Puzzles and Other Word Games from a Galaxy Far, Far Away, is coming out in November from Chronicle Books. It's available for pre-order on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, other booksellers, and of course, support your local independent bookstore by shopping for it on bookshop.org.
It's so exciting, James. Congratulations. I can't wait.
Thank you.
All right, if you're looking for these links and others that we talked about during the episode, check out our show notes page, available at skywalkingthroughneverland.com/star-warsologies. Also, check out our YouTube channel, Star Warsologies, where we post some episodes with related visuals.
If you have an idea for a topic for Star Warsologies or know an expert we should interview, let us know at Star Warsologies on Twitter and Instagram, or at starwarsologies@gmail.com. We also have a fan group on Facebook. It is called the Star Warsologies Podcast Fan Group. So join today and chat with us and your fellow listeners.
Also, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast on your favorite service, and share it with your friends in your group chat or next time you are talking Star Wars.
No topic is off limits, even whether dusting crops might really be like navigating through hyperspace.
Is this a fart joke?
No! What type of show do you think we have here? We are part of the Skywalking Network, where you can also find a variety of other great shows about Star Wars, Disney, and Marvel, including Topping Apes, the Max Effects podcast, the Neverland Clubhouse, and the flagship show, Skywalking Through Neverland. There's also their YouTube show, Today in Star Wars History, as well as their books on that. You can find all these shows and more at skywalkingnetwork.com.
All right, we'll see you next time on Star Warsologies, and we'll hopefully have our LA Comic-Con panel audio for you to enjoy.
LA Comic-Con!
Comic-Con!
I don't know. While we were talking about doing the time warp, I was like, so doing the time warp is what? Just a jump to the left and then a step to the right? I mean, it all fits in that tunnel.